She didn't look like someone who had ever saved a life. That was the problem. Hannah Brooks stood in the middle of Trauma Bay 2 with saline dripping from her scrubs, a patient chart face down on the floor, and every physician in the department staring at her like she was the most expensive mistake the hospital had ever made. The bag had slipped. A simple IV bag. And now the chief of surgery was walking toward her with the specific expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Quiet, deliberate, the kind of fury that doesn't need to raise its voice because it already owns the room. "Get out." 2 words. She would remember them for the rest of the night. What Dr. Victor Hale didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman standing in his trauma bay had once kept a man alive for 6 hours with 2 improvised tourniquets, a chest seal made from a torn wrapper, and nothing but her hands in the dark. No monitors, no surgical team, no anesthesia. Just her, the bleeding, and the decision to refuse what seemed inevitable. But that was a different life, and this one was about to change everything. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where we tell the stories that make your jaw drop and your heart race. Stories about people who get pushed down, written off, and then rise in ways nobody saw coming. Like this one. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Hannah Brooks and the night that Stonebridge Regional Medical Center learned exactly who they had been laughing at. The morning had started the way most of Hannah's mornings started. Early, quiet, and already wrong. She arrived at Stonebridge Regional at 6:47, 13 minutes before her shift, which was something she did every single day and which no one had ever once acknowledged. The hospital sat on the eastern edge of Dellum, Oregon, a mid-sized city that smelled like pine and river water, and on certain mornings, like the paper mill 3 miles north that the city council kept promising to regulate. Stonebridge was not a prestigious institution. It wasn't a teaching hospital. It didn't have a trauma center rating above level 3, and it showed in the equipment calibration schedules that slipped, in the supply closets that were always 2 sizes too small, in the fluorescent light in hallway C that had been flickering since February. Hannah knew where every broken thing was. She had been here 3 years. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, clipped her badge to her chest. Hannah Brooks, RN, Emergency Department, and took exactly 4 minutes to drink bad coffee from the machine near the nursing station before the overnight charge nurse, a compact, tired woman named Dottie Farrell, handed off the board. "Busy night," Dottie said, pulling on her jacket. "Bay 1's got a femur fracture waiting on ortho. Bay 3 is a 62-year-old chest pain we're watching, and Bay 4 is a kid who swallowed a Lego. His parents are both lawyers, so—" "I'll handle it," Hannah said. "I know you will." Dottie paused at the door. "Hale's got a full trauma rotation today, just so you're warned." Hannah nodded. She didn't say anything else. The warning was necessary. Dr. Victor Hale was Stonebridge's chief of surgery and the hospital's loudest advertisement for itself. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of silver hair that looked intentional and a confidence that worked in his favor unless you were the one he had decided wasn't worth his patience. He ran his trauma team, the way certain generals run armies. The results were impressive, the methods were brutal, and the people beneath him learned very quickly to stay out of his way or pay the price of crossing him. Hannah had crossed him 3 months ago by correctly identifying a tension pneumothorax before the attending did. She had said so quietly, in front of 2 other nurses and a resident, and the attending had confirmed it, and Hale had been standing at the nurse's station when it happened. He had not forgotten. Small hospitals have long memories. Hannah knew that too. The morning moved the way ER mornings move. Not fast exactly, but full. The way a crowded room is full, where there's no single loud thing but the noise is constant and low. She managed the Lego child, who was 4 years old and completely unbothered by the situation, and his parents, who were very bothered, and she did it without once raising her voice or making anyone feel stupid, which was harder than it sounded. She rotated vitals on the chest pain patient, updated the femur fractures chart, and was in the middle of preparing a new IV line for a dehydrated elderly woman in Bay 6 when the overhead PA announced Dr. Hale's trauma rotation was beginning in Bay 2. She finished the IV. She checked the flow rate. She made sure Mrs. Deering in Bay 6 had enough blankets and a cup of water she could actually reach. And then she moved toward Bay 2 because Bay 2 needed an additional nurse, and she was the closest one available. She should have anticipated what happened next. The trauma was a motorcycle accident. A 31-year-old male, conscious and frightened, road rash across most of his left side, and a suspected internal bleed based on his pressure and the way he was guarding his abdomen. Dr. Hale was already gloved and in position, resident Dr. Kyle Marsh at his side, 2 nurses from the rotation flanking the gurney. Hannah moved to the supply cart to pull the materials Hale would need for the abdominal assessment. She was pulling a second bag of normal saline from the top shelf when the cart rolled, wheels unlocked, floor slightly wet from someone's earlier spill, and the bag slipped from her grip and hit the edge of the counter and split. It wasn't a dramatic spill, it wasn't a flood, but it was a cold, sudden mess across her chest and thighs, and the sound of it made everyone look up. And then the chart that had been resting on top of the cart slid off the back of it and landed face down on the floor, and for exactly 3 seconds, the trauma bay was quiet. Then Dr. Kyle Marsh laughed. It wasn't mean, exactly. He was young, he was nervous, he found things funny when he was uncomfortable, and he didn't know Hannah well enough to understand the specific calculus of laughing at her versus laughing near her. But he laughed, and 2 of the rotation nurses smiled, and that was all Victor Hale needed. He turned from the patient slowly, the way a large animal turns when something in the environment has changed, and he looked at Hannah with the full weight of his attention and said, without raising his voice at all, "Is there a reason you're standing in my trauma bay looking like that?" "The cart rolled," Hannah said. "I'll get another bag." "You'll get out of my trauma bay," Hale said. "You're dripping saline on my floor, you've dropped your patient chart, and you don't have the composure to be in a trauma room. You should be managing the walk-in triage, not interfering with active care." "I wasn't interfering, I was pulling supplies." "I didn't ask for your interpretation." He looked at her badge, then back at her face, with the deliberate specificity of a man making sure she understood the distance between them. "Go find something you can handle, Nurse Brooks. Walk-ins, triage. Something that doesn't require you to be in the same room as acute trauma." The patient on the gurney was watching. The resident was watching. The nurses were watching. Hannah bent down and picked up the chart. She set it on the counter. She looked at Hale for exactly 1 second longer than she needed to, and then she said, "Yes, doctor," and she walked out. She did not slam the door. She did not say anything else. She went to the supply closet in hallway C, directly beneath the flickering light, and she stood there for a moment with her hands pressed flat against the shelf, and her eyes on the middle distance, and her breathing controlled in the specific way she had learned a long time ago, in a very different environment, for very different reasons. Then she changed her top, clipped her badge back on, and went to manage triage. The walk-in volume picked up around 10. The usual rotation of winter complaints, a broken finger from a weekend construction project, a child with an ear infection, 2 separate cases of what was probably the flu, but which both patients insisted was something worse, an older man with a rash on his forearm that turned out to be contact dermatitis from a new laundry detergent. Hannah moved through all of it efficiently, without fanfare, catching the flu patients before they contaminated the waiting room, correctly triaging the rash before it got bumped up the queue unnecessarily, noticing on the broken finger that the patient had a blood pressure reading high enough to warrant a quiet conversation about whether he was currently under a cardiologist's care. He wasn't. He had an appointment with his GP in 3 weeks. "I'd make it sooner," Hannah said. He looked at her. "You think it's serious?" "I think your blood pressure's high enough that it's worth a conversation before 3 weeks. That's all I'm saying." He pulled out his phone right there and rescheduled. She moved on. None of this was visible from the trauma side of the department. None of this was the kind of thing that got noticed or mentioned or charted in any file that mattered to the people who made decisions about nurses. The work she did in triage was invisible the way all maintenance is invisible. You only notice it when it stops. Around 11:30, a nursing aide named Marcus Lyle came to find her. Marcus was 23, enthusiastic in the specific way of people who hadn't yet been here long enough to have it worn down. And he liked Hannah in the uncomplicated way of someone who had watched her work and drawn his own conclusions. "Dr. Hale's looking for the Ortega chart," Marcus said. "The femur fracture from this morning. He said it wasn't in the system and wanted to know who handled intake." "I handled intake," Hannah said. "The chart's in the system. Ortega, D, admitted at 7:14. He's probably searching under the wrong admission date." I told him you did the intake. He said, Marcus stopped. What did he say? Marcus had the specific, uncomfortable expression of someone who'd been asked to report something unkind. He said if you filed it wrong, he wasn't going to be surprised. Hannah looked at the triage board. A new patient had just checked in. 68 years old, shortness of breath, currently being directed to a chair in the waiting room by the front desk. Go pull the Ortega chart and hand it directly to Hale's resident, she said. And then go get that patient a wheelchair. Which patient? The one at the front desk who's breathing too fast to be comfortable. Don't make her walk. Marcus turned and saw the woman and was already moving before Hannah finished the sentence. The chart was filed correctly. Dr. Marsh confirmed it 10 minutes later without ever sending word back to Hannah. She hadn't expected him to. The call came at 1:44 in the afternoon, while Hannah was on her lunch break in the ambulance bay, sitting on a concrete barrier with a turkey sandwich she'd been eating in pieces between interruptions since noon. Her personal cell, not her work phone. A number she didn't recognize, but a code embedded in the first 3 seconds of dead air that she recognized immediately. A specific pattern of tones, a sequence she hadn't heard in nearly 4 years, a sound she had genuinely believed she would never hear again. She swallowed what was in her mouth, set the sandwich down. Brooks, she said. The voice on the other end was male, clipped, professional in the way of people who have been trained to communicate under conditions where efficiency is the difference between outcomes. We have a priority transport. Trajectory puts arrival at your location in approximately 40 minutes. Package is critical. Multiple support personnel. You need to be ready. I'm a floor nurse, she said, at a level 3 facility. We're aware of your current situation, the voice said. A pause, brief enough to mean something. You're the closest asset we trust. 40 minutes, Brooks. Be ready. The line went dead. Hannah sat in the ambulance bay for 11 seconds. She counted them. She had learned to count in situations where the adrenaline could distort time if you let it, and she had learned not to let it. Then she stood, wrapped the rest of her sandwich in its paper, dropped it in the bin by the bay doors, and walked back into Stonebridge Regional Medical Center. She did not go to the nursing station. She went first to supply, where she pulled 3 trauma kits, 2 chest seal packages, and a set of airway supplies she had been quietly noting the expiration dates on for the past 2 months. She checked the defibrillator in Bay 2. She checked the blood product availability with the charge nurse under the pretext of updating the shortage board. She walked the trauma corridor once, slowly, noting which bays were occupied and which were available, where the obstructions were, where the lighting was bad. She was back at the nursing station with 12 minutes left on her break when Dr. Hale found her. He had the Ortega file in his hand. Marcus had apparently delivered it in person, and something in the sequence of events had cycled Hale back to the question of who had done what and why it was correct, which was not the conclusion he had wanted to arrive at. He stood at the nursing station with the chart and looked at Hannah with the expression of a man who had been wrong about a minor thing and was in the process of redirecting that discomfort into something else. You're pulling trauma supplies, he said. It wasn't a question. Routine check, Hannah said. No one authorized a routine check. The shortage board needed updating. The shortage board is managed by the supply team, not by you. Hannah looked at him. Is there something you need from me, Dr. Hale? He leaned slightly forward, and his voice dropped to the register of private warnings, the kind that aren't meant to be heard by anyone else. What I need from you is to stay in your lane. You're a triage nurse, not trauma, not supply management, triage. You don't pull kits, you don't check bays, and you don't make decisions about resources that aren't yours to make. Are we clear? We're clear, she said. Good. He straightened. If I find you in a trauma bay again without a specific assigned role, I'll start the documentation for reassignment. That's not a threat. That's procedure. He walked away. Hannah watched him go. She thought about telling him. She had a brief, specific mental image of saying the words, of explaining what the call was, what the code meant, what was coming toward this building in 34 minutes. She thought about the look that would cross his face. She didn't say anything, not because she wanted the satisfaction of the silence, but because there wasn't time for the conversation, and because some information travels better when it arrives on its own. She went back to her station and pulled up the supply database and continued filling in the shortage board with the information she had already gathered, quietly, accurately, without telling anyone what she was doing or why. The shortage board wasn't the point. knowing exactly what they had and where it was. The first sound was the helicopter. Hannah heard it before anyone else did, partly because she was listening for it, and partly because she had spent enough time under rotors to read them differently than civilians did. The specific pitch of a military transport moving with urgency rather than routine, the way the sound changed as it descended toward the hospital's rooftop pad. It was 22 minutes after the call, not 40. They had pushed the timeline. She was already moving toward Bay 2. Behind her, she heard the charge nurse pick up the intercom. The public address system crackle, the beginning of a trauma alert announcement. She heard the automatic doors at the ambulance bay slam open. She heard, underneath all of it, the specific low rumble of heavy vehicles. Not one, not two, but several, moving fast on the access road, and the sound had a weight to it that ordinary ambulances didn't carry. She had Bay 2 prepped, both trauma bays actually, before the first gurney came through the door. There were 3 of them simultaneously. 2 patients from the ambulance bay, 1 from the elevator from the roof. All 3 had the specific look of people who had been injured in a coordinated, violent way. Not accidents, not falls, not the ordinary catastrophes of civilian life. The tactical gear had been partially removed in transit, but there were cuts from it, bruises and patterns that told a story, and the man on the center gurney had a through-and-through wound to his left shoulder that had been field-dressed with a compression bandage that was holding but only just. Behind them came the 4th gurney. Hannah saw it in her peripheral vision and turned fully. The woman on it was in her late 50s, small in the way that people who carry authority can sometimes look unexpectedly small when they're horizontal and hurt. Her clothing was civilian but expensive. She had an oxygen mask already on, 2 large-bore IVs running in her arms, and the specific pallor of someone who had been losing blood for longer than the field team had wanted. Behind the gurney, 2 men in dark tactical gear with federal identification on their vests scanned the trauma bay with the practiced attention of professionals whose job was to identify everything in a room as either a threat or not a threat. Dr. Hale appeared in the corridor, alerted by the trauma page, buttoning his white coat as he walked. He took in the scene with the rapid assessment of a surgeon, multiple casualties, federal presence, resource requirements, and his voice went to its commanding register immediately. "Who's running this transport?" One of the tactical men turned. "We need your best trauma surgeon and a sterile bay. She's got a penetrating abdominal wound with compromised pressure. She's been stable for 20 minutes, but she's losing it." "I'm your surgeon," Hale said, stepping forward. "Bay 2, move." He was already directing his resident when he noticed Hannah. She was at the gurney. She had the woman's wrist in her hand and her eyes on the clock, and she was already talking. Not to Hale, not to the room, but directly to the team moving the gurney, quiet and specific, giving them positions and angles and a sequencing of movement that would get the patient from the corridor into the bay with the least possible disruption to the 2 IVs. "Nurse Brooks," Hale said sharply, "stand down. You're not assigned to this bay." Hannah didn't respond. She was adjusting the angle of the gurney. One of the tactical operators, a large man, broad-shouldered, with a scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, looked at Hannah, then at Hale, then back at Hannah. "You the one running trauma?" he said. Not to Hale, to her. "She's not," Hale said. "I am. I'm the chief of—" "Brooks," the operator said. It stopped the room for exactly 1 beat. Hannah looked up. The operator wasn't asking. He was confirming. His expression had changed into something that wasn't surprise, not quite. More like a recognition moving too fast to fully resolve. The face of someone who has seen something they weren't prepared to see and is rapidly recalculating everything. "We need to move her," Hannah said. "She's losing pressure. We need to move now." And the operator nodded. And the gurney moved. And Dr. Victor Hale stood in the corridor of his own hospital while a nurse he had spent all morning trying to remove from his trauma department directed a federal transport into Bay 2, and the men with tactical vests followed her instructions without a question, and the automatic bay doors slid shut behind them with a sound like punctuation. Outside, through the emergency entrance glass, 4 more armored vehicles had pulled into the ambulance bay. And they were not stopping. And they were not stopping. The second vehicle pulled in behind the first, and then the third, and the fourth, and by the time the 5th had cleared the access gate, the ambulance bay looked less like a hospital entrance and more like a staging area. Engines cutting, doors opening in sequence, Men in tactical gear moving with the low-frequency urgency of people who have already been through something bad and are trying to prevent something worse. Hannah heard none of it directly. She was inside Bay 2 with the doors closed and her hands already at work. The woman on the gurney, the federal official, the one who mattered most to the men outside, the one two of them had positioned themselves flanking without being asked, had a name Hannah didn't know yet, a face she didn't recognize, and a blood pressure reading of 84/51 that was moving in exactly the wrong direction. The field dressing on her abdomen had done its job, which was to say it had kept her alive long enough to get here, but it had not done more than that, and the clock on that generosity was running out. The resident on Hale's trauma rotation, Dr. Kyle Marsh, still visibly processing the last 10 minutes, was at the supply cart. He was moving, but he was moving the way people move when they're following the shape of their training without the engine of certainty behind it. Hannah watched him pull the wrong gauge needle for the pressure line and said, flatly and without preamble, "Larger bore. Left side, second shelf down." He looked at her. "Now, Marsh." He grabbed the right one. The senior nursing aide from the transport team, a woman in her 30s, combat efficient and clearly well-trained, with dried blood on her gloves that wasn't the patient's, had taken the opposite side of the gurney and was monitoring the IV lines with the precision of someone who had done this in a moving vehicle at night and considered this, by comparison, comfortable. She glanced at Hannah once, quickly, and then did not look away from her work. "Two large-bore IVs are running," Hannah said, not announcing it but stating it for the room, the way you do when the information needs to exist in shared space. "She needs a third access point, right antecubital, saline wide open until we can get type-specific blood. Does anyone have a blood type on her?" "A positive," the transport medic said. "Tell the lab, now. Not the desk. Walk directly to the lab and tell them we need A positive 4 units, as fast as they can pull it. Don't call it in." She looked at Marcus, who had appeared at the bay entrance with the specific wide-eyed expression of someone who had arrived at a situation significantly larger than expected. "Marcus, go." He went. She was already establishing the third IV line when the bay doors opened again and Dr. Victor Hale walked in. He had his surgical coat on now, fully buttoned, gloves already on, and he entered with the authority of a man reclaiming territory he considered his by definition. He took in the room, the positioning of the patient, the IV lines, the pressure readings on the monitor, Hannah's hands, and for a moment his face went through a sequence of reactions too fast to read cleanly. "Report," he said. "Penetrating abdominal wound, entry point left lower quadrant, field dressed approximately 45 minutes ago." Hannah didn't stop what she was doing. "Pressure's dropping, 82/49 as of 30 seconds ago. She's been fluid resuscitated in transit, but she's behind. I've called for blood." "I'll take it from here," Hale said. "She's not ready to move to surgery yet. She needs pressure stabilization first, or she won't survive the table." "I'm aware of how surgery works." "Then you know she's in shock and moving her right now increases the risk of cardiac event. Give me 6 minutes." The room had gone quiet in that specific way where everyone is still moving but all the sound has pulled back to a point. Hale looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He was a good surgeon. Hannah had never argued otherwise, had never thought otherwise, and the numbers were what they were. And he read them the way she had read them, and he made the decision a good surgeon makes, which was the decision the data supported, rather than the one his ego preferred. 6 minutes, he said. Then we move. She gave him 4.5. The process of stabilizing a patient who is bleeding internally has a rhythm to it that sounds brutal from the outside. The pace, the terseness, the absence of reassurance directed at the person in the center of it, but which is, in its own way, a form of intensive attention. Every movement is for the patient. There is no performance in it. Hannah worked without narrating herself, without asking for acknowledgement, without the professional theater that some of the ER physicians fell into when they were being watched. She was being watched. The 2 tactical operators who had come in with the transport had not left the bay. One stood near the door, scanning, his attention moving between the entrance and the patient in a regular sweep. The other, the broad-shouldered one with the jaw scar, the one who had said her name, was positioned to the left of the gurney, just far enough back to be out of the working space, and he was watching Hannah with the focused, unreadable attention of someone filing information away. She registered his attention and did not engage with it. There wasn't space for it. What she did register was the patient's response, the pressure beginning, slowly, to climb back toward a functional range, the color in the woman's face shifting from the gray of critical hypovolemia toward something less alarming. Not safe, not stable, but less alarming. The third IV line was doing its job. The fluid push was doing its job. And when Marcus returned from the lab at a near jog with the blood products, faster than she'd expected, which meant he'd run, she hung the first unit without breaking the rhythm of anything else. "She's at 90/60, Marsh said, watching the monitor. There was something new in his voice. Not quite awe, but adjacent to it, the specific register of someone revising their understanding of a situation. "Keep watching it," Hannah said. "The moment it drops again, you tell me." "What's her name?" The question came from the transport medic. Hannah looked up. The medic's composure was professional, but the edges of it were fraying slightly. "She's been a patient number since we loaded her. I want to know her name." Hannah looked at the tactical operator near the door. He said, "Evelyn Cross." The name landed in the room and sat there. Hannah watched Marsh's face process it. The brief confusion, then the widening of recognition, then the careful professional effort to set the recognition aside and continue working. She had a sense that she was watching the room understand, one person at a time, the specific magnitude of what was in front of them. "Evelyn Cross stays alive," Hannah said. It was not an inspirational statement. It was a clinical directive. "That's what we're doing. Everything else is secondary." Hale, who had been monitoring from the right side of the gurney, said nothing, but he also didn't leave. The doors opened again 12 minutes after the initial transport, and this time it was not more patience. The man who walked in was somewhere in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in environments where posture communicated rank more reliably than any uniform. He wore civilian clothes, dark pants, a gray jacket. But the way he moved through a hospital bay full of people without asking permission or announcing himself made the civilian clothes almost irrelevant. Behind him were two more federal agents and a woman in a suit who was already on a secure phone, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone relaying information that could not be repeated. The tactical operator with the jaw scar turned immediately. "Commander Rice?" "Status," the man said. "Stable. Barely. She lost more in transit than we estimated." Rice looked at the gurney, at Evelyn Cross, then at Hannah. There was a pause. Not long, not dramatic, just a beat where the man took in information and made an assessment, and something in his expression shifted in a way Hannah couldn't fully interpret. "Good call on the third line," he said. To her, specifically. She didn't respond to that. "She needs surgery in the next 20 minutes, or the stabilization buys us less than we think. Is there anything in her medical history I should know before she goes under?" "Previous abdominal surgery, appendix removed, 2019, no known allergies. She's on a blood pressure medication. The name's in her transit file." "Get me the file." He nodded at the woman with the phone, who moved immediately. "Doctor." Hale had been watching this exchange with an expression that had moved through several identifiable phases: confusion, irritation, a grudging reassessment, and he finally said to Rice, "I'm Dr. Victor Hale, Chief of Surgery. I'll be leading Ms. Cross's surgical team. I want to be clear that the decision-making in this room—" "Appreciate that, Doctor," Rice said without looking away from the monitor. "We'll need your surgical team ready in 10. It was not dismissive exactly. It was efficient, but Hale received it the way a man receives something that is structurally polite but functionally overriding, and his jaw tightened in a way that was invisible unless you were watching for it. Hannah was watching for it. Not with satisfaction. She didn't have the bandwidth for satisfaction. But with attention, the way you monitor a secondary variable in a complex system because it's relevant to outcomes. She handed off the cross-transfer to Marsh and the transport medic with specific verbal instructions about sequencing, about what to watch for, about what to tell the OR team the moment they arrived upstairs. She made sure Marsh had written down the blood pressure medication name. She made sure the blood products were logged. And then she stepped back, because her role in this specific thread had reached its transition point, and there were 4 other patients in the department who had been receiving reduced attention for the last 23 minutes. She was halfway to Bay 3 when Commander Rice fell into step beside her. "Walk with me a moment," he said. She kept walking. "I have other patients." I know, this is 60 seconds. She didn't stop or slow down, but she didn't tell him to leave, which he apparently interpreted correctly as agreement. The transport was compromised, he said. We believe we were tracked from Farview Junction. We lost comms for 11 minutes before we rerouted to this facility. He paused. We chose this facility for a reason. I know why you chose it, Hannah said. Then you understand that the threat may not have stopped at the road. We're running a security sweep of the building now. I need you to continue what you're doing and act normal. She stopped walking, turned to look at him. How many? Unknown. Possibly 2, possibly more. We're treating it as active until we have a clean sweep. This is a hospital, she said. There was no anger in it, just the flat statement of a fact and its implications. I know what it is, Rice said. That's why I'm telling you. She looked at him for a moment, at the face of a man who had made the calculation that she was someone worth telling. If they're inside, she said, they're not going to wait for the sweep to finish. No, he said, they're probably not. She turned and kept walking. What? Bay 3 was the 62-year-old chest pain patient from the morning, Mr. Gerald Foss, who had been waiting on a cardiology consult that the afternoon chaos had delayed. His ECG was unchanged, his troponin was borderline, and he was lying in the bed with the resigned patience of a man who had decided long ago that the best strategy with hospitals was to endure them quietly and hope for the best. His wife, a small, fierce woman named Patrice, had arrived at some point in the past hour and was sitting in the chair beside him, with her coat still on, watching the door. Hannah came in, updated his vitals, checked his IV, listened to the cardiology notes that had finally come through on the tablet. Foss watched her work. Busy day, he said. Stays that way, she said. Those military trucks out front, that normal? She glanced up. Through the narrow window at the top of Bay 3's exterior wall, you could see the edge of the ambulance bay, and at least 2 of the armored vehicles were still visible from this angle. We get all kinds, she said. Patrice Foss was watching her with the specific attention of a woman who had spent a long marriage learning to distinguish between the truth and a comfortable version of it. You're not worried, she said, about whatever's going on out there. I'm worried about your husband's troponin, Hannah said. That's the job. She was on her way out of Bay 3 when she heard it. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about it. It wasn't a crash or a shout or any of the sounds that the human brain is trained to recognize as emergencies. It was a door closing too quickly. A specific weighted sound from the direction of hallway C that lasted a fraction of a second longer than doors usually last, and carried with it the particular resonance of a door being pulled shut by someone moving fast and trying not to be heard. Hannah stopped. Hallway C connected the main ER corridor to the service access, the loading dock, the generator room, the hospital's secondary stairwell that most of the day staff never used because it came out 2 floors away from anything convenient. It was the route someone would take if they knew the hospital's layout and wanted to move through it without passing the nursing station or the main trauma bay. She looked at the clock on the wall. The tactical team's sweep had started approximately 8 minutes ago. Hallway C was probably not first on their list. She looked at the nursing station. Marcus was at the desk, handling 2 simultaneous calls. The charge nurse was with a patient. Everyone who was not directly occupied was in the trauma corridor or outside. She thought about going to find Rice. She thought about how long that would take. She turned and walked toward hallway C. Martin. The hallway was quiet, in the way that spaces are quiet when the noise from surrounding areas has been blocked by distance and closed doors. The flickering light was still flickering. It had been flickering all day. It would probably flicker for another 3 months, unless someone put in a maintenance ticket. And beneath it, the corridor was empty, except for the supply closet door, which was not fully closed. It had been fully closed at 11:40 when Hannah had stood inside it with her hands on the shelf. She had pulled it shut behind her. She had a specific memory of it because she had stood there long enough that the latch engaging had been a conscious sensation. It was not fully closed now. She moved to the wall and pressed her back against it, still, listening. The sounds of the main ER were audible but muffled. From inside the supply closet, nothing. Not silence, exactly. The absence of sound that is its own kind of sound. She looked down at her feet, at her hands. She was in scrubs, with a badge and a stethoscope and a pen light, and the small utility scissors she kept in her left breast pocket because they were useful, and she had spent years in environments where something with an edge was always useful. This was a hospital. She was a nurse. She pushed the closet door open. There were two of them. The first was already moving before the door was fully open, pushing off the shelf, turning, hands coming up. And Hannah stepped inside the arc of his reach instead of away from it, which was not what he expected, and she got a grip on his forearm and used his own momentum to redirect him into the metal shelving unit along the left wall with a sound that was loud enough to be alarming and which she could already hear drawing attention from somewhere down the corridor. The second had a phone in his hand, not a weapon, but his free hand was moving toward something at his waistband, and she didn't wait to find out what, stepping directly toward him and driving her elbow into the inside of his wrist as his hand came up, hard and precise, and whatever he had been reaching for stayed where it was as he lost grip of the phone and the coordination of that arm simultaneously. The whole thing took 11 seconds. She had the first man's arm pinned behind him against the shelf with enough leverage that moving it would require a decision he was not currently interested in making, and the second was backed against the far wall holding his wrist with an expression that had moved from operational composure to something rawer and more honest. She was breathing hard. She was aware of that. Her hands were not shaking, but her heart was doing the thing it did. Not panic, not exactly, but the specific physical response of a system that had been dormant for years, being called back into use without the preparation time she would have preferred. From the corridor, she heard running footsteps. "In here," she called. The door opened. Two of Rice's operators came through it fast and stopped at the sight of what was already resolved. The two men, the positions, Hannah in the middle of it, with a grip on one man's arm that suggested she knew what she was doing and had known it for longer than any of them had understood. The operator with the jaw scar was not the first through the door, but he was the second. And he looked at the room, and at Hannah, and at the two men. And then he looked at Hannah again with the expression of a man who has had a suspicion confirmed by a piece of evidence much larger than he had anticipated. "I've got the first one," she said to him, steady, already transitioning her grip so it could be handed off. "The second needs his right wrist looked at." He was reaching. The operator stepped forward and took the hand off without a word, and Hannah stepped back, and she was in the corridor and walking, not running, walking, back toward the main ER before anyone in the supply closet had fully processed what had just happened. Her hands were not shaking, but she pressed them flat against her thighs for a moment, walking, just to be sure. At the nursing station, Marcus was still on the phone. The charge nurse was still with a patient. The flickering light in hallway C was still flickering. She picked up the tablet from the station and pulled up Gerald Foss's cardiology consult and stood at the desk reading it with her breathing at a rate that a casual observer would have clocked as entirely normal. She read the same paragraph 4 times before the words resolved into meaning. From down the corridor, she heard voices, controlled, clipped, the specific rapid communication of operators who had found something. And then the sound of the stairwell door opening, and then feet on stairs, moving upward. They were not done. The sweep had found 2. But Rice had said possibly more, and Rice did not strike her as a man who overestimated, which meant he had specific reason to use that qualifier, and if the 2 in the supply closet had been positioned in hallway C with access to the secondary stairwell, their purpose had not been reconnaissance. Their purpose had been the floor above, where Evelyn Cross was currently in surgery. Hannah looked at the tablet. At the cardiology consult she hadn't finished reading. At the nursing station, which needed her, and the patients in the bays, which needed her, and the specific reality of being one person in a building where multiple things were happening simultaneously, and she could only be one place. She set the tablet down. She looked at Marcus, who had just finished his call and was reaching for the next chart. "If anyone asks where I am," she said, "I'm checking the OR supply inventory." "Are you?" he said. She was already heading for the stairwell. The door was heavy and metal and opened with the specific resistance of something that was used rarely enough to have forgotten what regular use felt like. Hannah took the stairs at a pace that was fast without being loud, heel to toe, weight controlled, the way you move when noise is a variable that matters. 1 flight up was the surgical floor. 2 was the ICU. The stairwell smelled like concrete and cleaning solution and the faint metallic undertone that old hospital infrastructure always carries. And it was empty, which told her the operators had already moved through it, or were ahead of her on the upper landing. She reached the surgical floor door and stopped, listened. From inside, muffled through the door, she could hear the ambient noise of a working OR floor, the hiss of ventilation, a distant monitor alarm being silenced, the low murmur of intercom communication. Nothing sharp, nothing wrong sounding in the obvious way. She pushed the door open. The corridor was white and bright in the way surgical floors always are, the lighting calibrated for precision rather than comfort, and it was less crowded than the ER. 3 nurses at the station midway down, a scrub tech moving between supply rooms, a man in a gray maintenance uniform crouching near the electrical panel at the far end of the hallway. Hannah started walking. She had covered approximately 20 feet when her brain registered what her eyes had already taken in and not yet processed. The maintenance uniform was wrong, not wrong in a way that announced itself. The color was right, the general shape was right. But the boots were tactical, low profile, and laced in a pattern she recognized, and the man's posture near the electrical panel was the posture of someone looking at a panel he understood rather than one he was there to service. His hands were moving with familiarity. The nursing station was 15 feet to her left. The OR suite, where Evelyn Cross was currently on the table, was 30 feet ahead, and through a set of double doors she could see from where she stood. The man at the panel had not looked up. He didn't know she had seen him. Hannah kept walking at the same pace, same direction, like someone with a destination and no particular interest in anything along the way. She reached the nursing station and stopped there naturally, picked up the first chart on the rack as if she'd come for it, and said to the nurse closest to her, a young woman whose badge read Chen, and whom she immediately redirected because the instructions in her head were clear about that name being absent from this story. So she looked instead at the nurse beside her, whose badge read Pollard. Do you have the cross surgical update? Nurse Pollard turned toward the computer, turned away from the hallway. Hannah said quietly, without moving her lips more than necessary, don't look down the hall. There's a man at the electrical panel who doesn't work here. I need you to call security and tell them there's a maintenance issue on the surgical floor and you need a physical check. Don't say anything else. Don't use the PA. Pollard's hands paused on the keyboard for a fraction of a second. Okay, she said. Her voice was level. Hannah revised her opinion of Pollard upward immediately. Hannah set the chart down and walked back into the corridor, this time angling toward the OR double doors rather than the panel, which meant she was moving across the man's peripheral vision rather than toward him. She had covered half the distance when he looked up. Their eyes met for less than a second. It was enough. He came off the floor fast, and Hannah was already moving. Not away, because away put the nursing station behind her and Pollard in the line of whatever this became, but sideways, into the alcove beside the supply room, which was recessed enough to change the geometry of the space. He followed because he had to, because letting her reach the OR doors or the nursing station were both worse outcomes for him than engaging in the alcove. He was larger than the 2 in the supply closet and moved with more training, and Hannah knew within the first 2 seconds that this was going to cost her something. He got his forearm across her throat before she could redirect it, and she went with it instead of against it, dropping her weight and rotating out from under his reach. But the rotation took her into the wall, and her shoulder hit hard enough to send a specific spike of pain up through her neck. She registered the pain and filed it and kept moving. What she had was positioning and the fact that he couldn't make noise any more than she could, because noise brought the nurses and noise brought the operators who were already in the building, and he needed Evelyn Cross on that table, and the power to the OR suite interrupted before anyone could stop it. She had read his objective from the electrical panel. She understood what he was doing. She drove her thumb into the pressure point behind his jaw, not with finesse, with intention. And when his head jerked back, she got her forearm across his windpipe, the way someone does when they've done it in the dark, in the rain, at the end of a mission where everything else had already gone wrong. He went to his knee. He did not stay there. He pushed back up with his legs and got his hand on her wrist, and they were both against the alcove wall, locked and breathing hard, when the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor opened and 2 of Rice's operators came through it. The calculation changed instantly. Hannah felt him feel it, the shift in his body, the recalculation of odds, and she adjusted her grip in the half-second before he decided what to do next. He chose to run, which was the wrong choice, because the corridor was a straight line and the operators were already moving, and she kept her grip long enough to slow his first step. and that was enough. They had him down and cuffed in 9 seconds. Hannah stood in the alcove with her back against the wall and her hand pressed to her shoulder. The pain was specific and manageable, bruised, possibly, not broken. She knew the difference. The operator with the jaw scar. She had started thinking of him as Scar, internally, because she didn't know his name, and the alternative was Operator 2, which felt clinical even inside her own head, was one of the two from the stairwell. He crossed to her while his partner controlled the man on the floor and said, "He reached the panel?" "Yes," she said. "I don't know how far he got." Scar looked at the panel, then at her. "You're hurt." "I'm functional. Get someone to check the panel before the OR loses power." That was the objective. He looked at her for one more second with the expression he'd been wearing since the supply closet, the one she still couldn't fully read, and then he was on his radio and moving toward the panel. Hannah pushed off the wall and went to the OR double doors. The scrub nurse inside stopped her at the window. Standard protocol. She couldn't go in without suiting up, and she wasn't going to suit up because she wasn't the surgeon and she didn't need to be inside. What she needed was line of sight and a status report, and she got both through the observation window. Hale was at the table. That much she could see, his posture, his movements, the choreography of a man who was genuinely good at the specific thing he was currently doing. She had never argued that. The surgical team was moving around him in the careful, efficient pattern of people who had worked together long enough to anticipate each other, and Evelyn Cross was draped and opened and being repaired by the best hands available at Stonebridge Regional, which were, in this specific context, the right hands for the job. The monitor lines were stable. Not good. This was surgery. Nothing was good during surgery. But stable in the way that means the management is working. The crisis is contained inside a controlled environment, and barring the unforeseen, the outcome is probable. Hannah stood at the window for 90 seconds. She was not aware, until someone spoke beside her, that she had pressed her forehead against the glass. "She's going to make it." She straightened. Rice was beside her, close enough that she hadn't heard him approach, which told her either that she was more depleted than she'd thought, or that he was very good at being quiet. Possibly both. "She has a chance," Hannah said. "That's different." "Third one's in custody. Your hallway." He paused. "We think that's the last of them." "You think?" "Building sweep is 92% complete. The remaining 8% is the roof access and the sub-basement maintenance tunnels. The tunnels connect to the loading dock," she said. "I know. Teams are there." She looked back through the observation window. The monitor lines continued their steady pattern. "The panel. Did he reach the panel?" "He interfaced with it. He didn't complete the interruption. The OR power is intact." Rice paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality, like he was deciding how much of something to say. "You stopped him before he could finish." She didn't respond to that. "Brooks." His voice changed registers. Not softer, exactly, but more direct in a way that wasn't about the operation. "How long have you been here? At this hospital?" 3 years. 3 years, he repeated, and there was something in it that wasn't quite disbelief, but lived in the same neighborhood. "I left," she said. "That was my choice." "I know." He looked through the observation window. "For what it's worth, yeah. Some people argued you shouldn't have been let go." "I wasn't let go, I resigned." "People argued about that too." She looked at him. He had the face of a man who had been in rooms where decisions were made about other people and had not always agreed with what was decided and had carried that with him. She recognized the look. She'd seen it in her own mirror in the year after she left. "What does the convoy intelligence show?" she asked. "About who coordinated this?" He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was the kind that contained information he was deciding whether to release. "We have communication intercepts from the tracking team that followed our convoy from Farview Junction, encrypted. We're working through the decryption, but preliminary analysis shows the coordination originated from inside a civilian network, not external. Someone who had access to our routing information, our timeline, and—" He stopped. "And what?" "And this facility's floor plan," he said. "Specific, detailed, including the secondary stairwell access and the OR electrical panel location." Hannah felt the shape of what he was saying before he finished saying it. "That information," she said, "is not public. That's not a building directory. That's internal documentation." "Yes," Rice said. Someone in this hospital gave it to them. That's where the intercepts are pointing. He looked at her directly. We'll know more when the decryption is complete. But yes. She stood with that for a moment. The observation window showed Hale's hands, precise and controlled, doing the work they were designed to do. She thought about the morning, about Bay 2, about the Ortega chart, about Hallway C and the supply closet, and the flickering light. She thought about the sequence of a day that had gone from humiliation to crisis to something that didn't have a clean name yet. She thought about who, in this building, had known the routing, had known the timeline, had known the floor plan well enough to give someone else a map. The intercepts, she said. When will decryption finish? Best estimate, an hour, maybe 2. She nodded, said nothing else, turned from the window and walked back toward the stairwell. The ER downstairs had reached the specific chaotic equilibrium of a department that has absorbed a mass trauma event and is now managing the aftermath. Not the shock of the first wave, but the sustained pressure of too many needs and not enough resources. The kind of state that doesn't resolve quickly and requires people to keep moving precisely when the adrenaline that made moving easy has begun to recede. Hannah came through the stairwell door and back into the corridor, and within 40 seconds was at the nursing station receiving a verbal handoff from the charge nurse. 4 new walk-ins during the chaos, 2 of whom had been waiting long enough to be escalating in their discomfort. And Bay 4 was asking for a pain management update on the shoulder fracture that had come in just before the convoy. She managed it, all of it. She moved through the bays in sequence, adjusting, updating, communicating, doing the invisible maintenance that kept the department functional. Her shoulder hurt. She noted it and moved on. Marcus found her in Bay 6 at the 40-minute mark, when the initial chaos had settled into something that merely required constant attention. He had the expression of someone who had been processing the afternoon in installments and had just reached an installment he wasn't sure how to handle. The guy they arrested upstairs, he said, in the maintenance uniform. What about him? Word's getting around. The nurses are, everyone's trying to figure out what happened. He paused. Someone said you were up there, when they found him. Someone said, Hannah said. Were you? She was checking the IV line on the patient in Bay 6, an elderly woman, Mrs. Deering from earlier, still there, still needing more attention than the day had permitted her to receive. I was checking OR supply inventory, she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Deering's potassium is low, Hannah said. Can you get me the replacement protocol from the cart? He went. He didn't ask again. She was finishing the adjustment on Mrs. Deering's line when her phone buzzed. The number was Rice. She stepped to the corridor. Decryption finished early, he said. 43 minutes. And? A pause that told her the answer before the words did. The information shared with the network, floor plan, routing data, OR panel configuration, it was sent from an internal hospital account. We have IP confirmation. We have timestamps. The account belongs to a member of your medical staff. She already knew the shape of the answer, had known it since the observation window, in the way you know things you haven't said aloud yet because saying them changes what happens next, and you're not ready for what happens next. Who? She said. Victor Hale, Rice said. The corridor was quiet. The flickering light in hallway C was flickering. Down the hall, through the double doors, she could hear the sounds of the ER continuing its work. The monitors, the voices, the ordinary catastrophes of a Tuesday afternoon. He's still in surgery, she said. I know, Rice said. We need him to finish. She understood that too. You don't arrest a surgeon in the middle of a procedure. You let him close. You let the patient survive. And then you take him the moment the gloves come off, and the law takes it from there. How long? She said. Surgical team says 40 minutes, maybe less. She said, I'll be here, and ended the call. She stood in the corridor. She thought about 40 minutes and what they contained. Victor Hale, with his hands inside Evelyn Cross's abdomen, repairing what someone else's network had tried to destroy, while the evidence of his involvement sat in a decrypted file on a federal server 3 floors above him. She thought about the specific, awful irony of a man doing the one thing he was genuinely good at, in service of a patient he had helped put in danger, unaware that the moment he tied off the last suture and stepped back from the table, everything was over. She thought about the morning, about stay out of my trauma room. She thought, 40 minutes. She went back to Bay 6 and finished updating Mrs. Deering's chart. The 40 minutes became 38. She knew because Rice sent a single word to her phone, closing. And she set down the chart she was holding, told Marcus she'd be back in 10, and walked toward the surgical corridor. She was passing the main trauma bay when Dr. Kyle Marsh stopped her. He was standing at the entrance to Bay 2, and he had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the nervous energy of the morning, not the quiet professional recalibration of the afternoon. Something tighter, more direct. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Walk with me," she said. He did. The three people they arrested, two downstairs, one upstairs, the one in the maintenance uniform. He kept his voice low. "I know what that panel accesses. I know what would have happened to the OR if he'd completed the circuit interruption." "Yes," she said. "She would have died." "Probably," Hannah said. "Yes." "You went up there. You stopped him." She didn't respond. "I laughed this morning," Marsh said. "In the trauma bay. When you dropped the saline, I laughed." He said it without elaboration, without excuse, in the flat way of someone making an accounting rather than an apology. Hannah stopped walking, looked at him. He was young, and he was uncomfortable, and he was being honest with her, which cost him something in a way she could see on his face, and she thought about the various responses available to her and chose the one that was true. "You didn't know," she said. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She held his gaze for a moment. "But it makes it explicable. Those are different things, Marsh. Learn the difference. It'll make you a better doctor." She walked on. The surgical floor corridor was busy in a different way than it had been an hour ago. The crisis-suppressed version of normal activity reasserting itself. Nurses moving between rooms, the sounds of post-op equipment, the particular controlled noise of a floor that had been holding its breath and is now slowly exhaling. She could see, through the OR suite window, the activity winding down, the counts being completed, the draping coming away, the team moving into closure posture. Rice was in the corridor with two federal agents. He saw her coming and nodded. She stood beside him and watched through the window. She watched Victor Hale close. He was precise. He was controlled. His hands, she had to admit, were exceptional. The kind of skill that takes years and genuine talent, and she thought about what it costs a person to be genuinely talented at something and also make the choices he had made. And she decided that was not her accounting to do. That was for courts and time and whatever Hale had to live with, and she was not going to carry it. The final suture went in. Hale stepped back from the table. He began peeling his gloves off to the scrub nurse. The specific post-surgical decompress of a man who has finished a difficult thing and is returning to his own body. He didn't see them through the window. The surgical suite lights were bright, and the corridor was relatively dim and the glass angled away from his sight line. The OR door opened. The scrub nurse came out first, and then the anesthesiologist, and then Hale, still removing his surgical cap, already reaching for his phone with the habitual efficiency of someone reconnecting with the outside world after an hour of enforced disconnection. He saw Rice first, then the two federal agents, then Hannah. His face went through something in the 3 seconds before anyone spoke. Recognition, confusion, and then something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite resignation, but contained elements of both. Rice said, "Dr. Hale, step away from the door, please." Hale looked at Hannah. Not at Rice. At Hannah. She looked back at him. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the situation wasn't already saying more effectively. She simply looked at him and let him look at her, and in that looking she understood. From the way his expression shifted, from the way his eyes moved between her face and the federal agents and back, that he had known or suspected that something was coming and that some part of him had not expected it to arrive while she was standing next to it. "Dr. Hale," Rice said again. Hale turned away from her. His shoulders dropped, not in collapse, but in the specific physical movement of a decision being made, a posture being abandoned. "I want a lawyer," he said. "You'll have one," Rice said. The agents moved forward, and from the corridor behind them, from somewhere down the hall, where the day shift was still working and the machines were still monitoring and the ER below was still taking patients and turning them around and sending them back into their lives, came the sound of an alert tone, sharp, sustained, cutting through everything else. Hannah's head came up. She recognized it before her brain had finished processing it. Cardiac. Second floor. Room 12. Post-op recovery. Evelyn Cross. Hannah was running before Rice could speak, back down the corridor, through the double doors, and the sound was getting louder as she moved toward it. And when she came through the recovery room door, the monitor was screaming, and the recovery nurse was already at the bed and calling for help. And Evelyn Cross's cardiac trace was doing the thing that meant the surgery had not been the end of it, that something had been missed or had shifted or had simply decided now was the moment. And there were 3 minutes, maybe 4, before the window closed. She pushed past the recovery nurse and got her hands on the patient and said, "Get the crash cart. Get it now." And the world narrowed to the space between her hands and the woman on the bed and the monitor above them and the sound that kept screaming and would not stop. And the world narrowed to the space between her hands and the woman on the bed and the monitor above them and the sound that kept screaming and would not stop. The trace on the monitor was ventricular fibrillation, not the flat line of movies, not the clean stop of something simply ceasing, but the chaotic, frantic signal of a heart that had lost its coordination and was firing in all directions at once, burning itself out in a frenzy of disorganized electrical activity. It was survivable. It was survivable for a specific window of time, and that window was measured in minutes, and the crash cart was not yet in the room. "Where's the cart?" Hannah said. Not a question, a location request. "Coming," the recovery nurse, a woman named Iris, Hannah could see her badge, said from the doorway. She was pulling it. It was heavy and it caught on the door threshold and she yanked it through. "Pads," Hannah said, and was already cutting the gown away from Cross's chest, the small utility scissors she kept in her breast pocket doing exactly what they were designed for. And when Iris got the cart alongside the bed, Hannah had the patient's chest clear and her hands positioned, and she said, "Charging, 200. Charging," Iris confirmed. Hannah looked at the trace. Still fib, still the same chaotic signal. "Clear," she said. The shock moved through Cross's body in the specific involuntary way that always looked more violent than it was, and which was, in this moment, the most targeted intervention available. The trace spiked and then 3 seconds, 4, resolved into something organized. Not perfect, not the clean sinus rhythm of a textbook, but organized. A heartbeat with structure. Hannah watched the monitor for 8 seconds without moving. The rate was 52, low. But it was there and it was regular, and the shape of it on the screen was a heart that had been shocked back into coordination rather than one that was preparing to fail again. "Rate's 52, Iris said. "I see it. Get cardiology down here. Not a page, a phone call, direct line. Tell them post-surgical VF event. Converted, monitoring for recurrence." Hannah checked the IVs, both running, both intact, and then checked Cross's airway and color and the specific combination of clinical signs that told her what the monitor couldn't. The color was wrong. Not alarming wrong, but post-event wrong. The grayish undertone of someone whose perfusion had just been severely disrupted and whose body was running the damage assessment. "She needs a 12 lead now." Iris was already moving. From the doorway, Rice appeared. He had left the arrest scene. Hannah registered that as significant, that he had left federal agents with a suspect in custody to be here. And he stood at the threshold with the specific contained energy of someone who wanted to be inside the room and was preventing himself. "She's in sinus," Hannah said, without looking at him. 52. "We converted her." "What happened?" "Post-surgical arrhythmia. She may have had an underlying cardiac issue the transit file didn't capture, or the surgery triggered a cascade. I don't know yet. Neither does anyone else." She watched the monitor. The rate ticked up to 55. "She needs the cardiologist, and she needs a full reevaluation before anyone makes any claims about her status." Rice was quiet. "She's alive," Hannah said. "That's what I can tell you right now." He nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. The cardiologist, a compact, methodical man named Dr. Abram Tolliver, who had been in the middle of a chart review in his office when Iris called, arrived in 4 minutes, which was fast by any standard, and which Hannah noted with genuine relief because Tolliver was good. She had worked with him twice in the past year on borderline cases, and he had the quality she valued most in consultants, which was the ability to listen to a clinical handoff without simultaneously constructing his own narrative over the top of it. She gave him the handoff in 90 seconds. He listened. He looked at the monitor, at the 12-lead Iris had printed, at the patient. "Prolonged QT on the pre-op strip?" he asked. "Not flagged," Hannah said. "But I didn't run the pre-op strip myself. The measurements may not have been calibrated to her baseline." "Okay?" He was already at the bedside. "She's on a blood pressure medication. Which one?" "Veramax, according to the transit file." He looked up at her briefly. The look contained information that Veramax, combined with the specific stress of emergency surgery and the fluid shifts of the resuscitation she had received in the ER, created a pharmacological environment that was conducive to exactly the kind of QT prolongation that could trigger ventricular fibrillation in a susceptible individual. It was not anyone's fault in the sense of a clear error. It was the convergence of factors that emergency medicine is specifically designed to prevent and still sometimes cannot. "She needs continuous monitoring," he said. "Likely magnesium supplementation. I want serial ECGs every 15 minutes for the next 2 hours." "I'll set it up," Iris said. Hannah stepped back. This was Tolliver's thread now, and she had handed it off correctly, and she trusted him with it. She looked at Cross, at the small, pale, important woman in the bed, who was breathing, whose heart was beating in a pattern that currently had structure, and she held the look for a moment longer than was clinically necessary, and then she turned and walked out of the recovery room. In the corridor, Rice was on a phone call. He met her eyes and held up one finger. "Wait." And she waited, because she had questions that required him to answer them, and his call was apparently the kind that required his full attention, because his face had changed into the expression of a man receiving information that was reordering his understanding of something. He ended the call, put the phone in his pocket, looked at her. "Hale's lawyer is already here," he said. "Fast." "How fast?" "He was in the building when we made the arrest." Hannah held that for a moment. A lawyer who was already present in the building at the moment of arrest. "He knew," she said. "We think so. We think he knew the timeline was compromised. We think he may have been preparing to leave." Rice's jaw was tight. The lawyer being here suggests he had a window, maybe 20 minutes, maybe less, where he thought he could still exit the situation cleanly. And then Cross went into arrhythmia, and he couldn't leave because he was the only surgeon available, and by the time he closed, we were waiting. "The arrhythmia kept him in the building," Hannah said. Yes, she thought about that. The specific, unintended chain of it, the way one thing leads to another in ways that no one plans and no one can predict, and how the moments that look like chaos from inside them sometimes have a structure that only becomes visible afterward. "What does the evidence show?" she asked. "Beyond the communication intercepts." "Financial records. We've been in contact with federal banking analysis since the intercepts came in. Hale had significant debts. Not public, not visible in his profile here, but real. Gambling, primarily. Private debts to private parties who became leveraged creditors." Rice spoke evenly, without editorializing. "Approximately 8 months ago, contact was initiated by the network. They offered debt relief in exchange for information. He provided it over a period of 4 months. Floor plans, scheduling data, staff rotations. When the cross-transport was rerouted to this facility, they reached out again. He provided the routing confirmation and the OR electrical panel access codes." Hannah looked at the recovery room door. Through the small window, she could see Tolliver at the bedside, Iris running the ECG equipment, Cross's chest rising and falling in the regular pattern of someone who was, for the moment, holding on. "He saved her life this afternoon," Hannah said, "and almost got her killed." "Yes," Rice said. "Both of those things are true." "Both of those things are true," he agreed. She looked down the corridor. The surgical floor had the hushed, pressurized quality of a space where multiple significant things are happening simultaneously, and everyone is trying to manage their awareness of all of them at once. "Where is he now?" "Interview room, first floor. The lawyer is with him. We have agents." Rice paused. "We also have the hospital CEO, Dr. Samuel Grant. He arrived 20 minutes ago. Someone called him about the arrests. He's asking a lot of questions." "Who's answering them?" "Right now, no one, but that won't hold." Hannah thought about Samuel Grant. She had met him twice, briefly, in the context of department meetings she had been required to attend. He was the kind of administrator who presented as decisive and warm in public settings, and who governed through careful management of information, which was a charitable way of saying he preferred to know things before they became problems rather than after. He would want answers. He would want them framed in a way that protected the institution. That framing was not her problem. But the truth of it was, the staff needs to know what happened, she said. It's not a position, she said. It's a fact. There are nurses and techs and residents in this building who worked with Victor Hale today and who are going to find out in the next 2 hours, through rumor or the news or their phones, that he was arrested on federal charges. They deserve to hear something coherent before the incoherent version reaches them. She looked at Rice. That's not politics. That's how you keep a department functional. He considered her for a moment. I'll talk to Grant, he said. Good. She started back toward the stairwell. Brooks. His voice had the specific quality of someone saying a name when what they actually mean is something larger. She stopped. Hale's lawyer is filing a motion to suppress the intercept evidence. Standard first move. It won't work. The legal basis for the intercepts is solid, but it delays the formal charge timeline. He paused. While the motion is active, Hale's team will likely argue that any additional witness testimony should be deferred, including yours. I wasn't a witness to his communications. You were present at his arrest, and you have, he chose the word carefully, a history with him in this building. His lawyer will argue that the arrest circumstances were influenced by personal conflict between Hale and a specific staff member. She understood what he was telling her, that Hale's defense, in its opening move, was going to try to make the story about her, about the nurse who held a grudge, about the morning in the trauma bay and the supply closet check and the OR floor and everything that could be arranged into a narrative of motivation if you were willing to arrange it without regard for the sequence of actual events. That argument won't hold either, she said. No, but it takes time to fail, and while it's failing, his team will be looking for anything they can use, any irregularity in your actions today, any moment where you deviated from protocol. He met her eyes. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when it starts. She held his gaze for a moment, and she thought about the supply closet and the surgical floor and Evelyn Cross's chest under the defibrillator pads. And she thought about what a deviation from protocol actually looked like when it was the difference between a patient living and dying. And she thought about what it meant to have that used as a weapon. Let them look, she said. She went back down the stairs. The ER at 4:30 in the afternoon had reached the hour where the day's events had fully metabolized into institutional reality. The armored vehicles still partially visible in the ambulance bay, the federal presence still moving through the building, and the staff operating in that specific mode of professional persistence where you keep doing the job because the job doesn't stop even when everything around it has. Hannah came through the stairwell door, and Marcus was immediately there, not in the way of someone who had been waiting anxiously, but in the way of someone who had been doing his work and had noted her reappearance as a data point. 3 new walk-ins, he said. Bay 7's asking about the discharge paperwork for the Lego kid. Apparently he's been here since morning, and Foss in Bay 3 is asking for you specifically. I'll take Foss first. Start the Lego discharge. Get someone to sign off on the walk-in triage. Dr. Marsh is available, Marcus said. She paused slightly. Tell him. Gerald Foss was sitting up in Bay 3, which was a good sign. Sitting up required energy, and energy required function, and his color was better than it had been that morning. Patrice Foss was still in the chair beside him, coat still on, and she looked at Hannah when she came in with the expression of a woman who has been patient for a long time and has decided she has been patient enough. The cardiology consult, Hannah said, pulling up his chart. Tolliver is tied up right now, but his resident reviewed your results. The troponin trend is flat. It hasn't moved. That's actually good news. It suggests the initial elevation was a stress response, not a cardiac event. So what does that mean? Foss said. It means we keep monitoring you for another few hours, and then we make a decision about discharge or overnight observation. She looked at him. How are you feeling? Like a man who's been in a hospital bed since 7 in the morning watching very alarming things happen through a very small window. The vehicles, she said, and the people, and the whatever that was upstairs. The announcement. His eyes were sharp. He was the kind of man who paid attention and who had been paying attention all day. The young man on the news app on my phone is saying there's been a federal arrest at Stonebridge Regional, that one of the doctors is involved in something. I can't discuss other patients or staff, Hannah said. I know that, Foss said. I'm not asking you to. He looked at her for a moment. I'm asking if you're all right, that's all. She looked at him. At the unexpected simplicity of the question, the directness of it, the way it arrived without agenda or manipulation. I'm functional, she said. That's a very careful answer, Patrice said. It's a true one. Foss made a small sound that might have been a laugh. The nurse who's been running this department all day, in the middle of what appears to be a federal operation, is telling me she's functional. I believe her, but I think she could probably stand to sit down for 5 minutes. I could stand to do a lot of things, Hannah said. I'll be back to check on you in an hour. She left Bay 3 and stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the wall outside the bay and her eyes on the ceiling, and she let herself have 40 seconds of not moving. Her shoulder hurt. She was aware, now that she had paused, of the cumulative weight of the day, not in a way that incapacitated her, but in the honest physical way of a body that has been asked to do significant things and is keeping account. 40 seconds. She pushed off the wall and kept moving. The hospital CEO arrived in the ER at 5:04. Dr. Samuel Grant was a man in his early 60s who dressed with the careful precision of someone who had decided that appearance was a form of communication, and he communicated it consistently. Dark suit, no tie, the measured confidence of institutional authority. He came through the ER entrance with 2 administrators behind him and went to the nursing station and asked for the charge nurse, and the charge nurse pointed him toward Hannah, and he looked at her with the brief recalibration of a man who had expected someone different. She was standing at the station finishing a chart update. She had dried saline on her scrubs from that morning. Her badge was straight. Nurse Brooks, he said. Dr. Grant? I've been briefed by Commander Rice. I want to hear your account directly. She closed the chart. What specifically? Your actions today, starting with the trauma response and ending with... He paused, choosing the frame carefully. Whatever happened on the surgical floor. She gave it to him cleanly. Not abridged, not elaborated. The sequence of events from the phone call through the stabilization of Cross, through the 3 security threats, through the recovery room arrhythmia, stated in the same register she would use for a clinical handoff. She did not characterize herself. She did not characterize Hale. She described what happened in the order it happened and let it speak. Grant listened without interrupting, which she had not expected. He had the face of a man who was receiving information that was simultaneously better and worse than what he had anticipated. Better because the outcomes were good. Worse because the implications of how they had been achieved required him to account for how the day had started. I need to ask you something, he said when she finished. Go ahead. This morning, the incident in Bay 2. He said it carefully, like something with sharp edges. Dr. Hale's decision to remove you from the trauma rotation. He told me to manage triage, she said. And your response? I managed triage. He held her gaze. I've been CEO of this institution for 11 years, Nurse Brooks. In that time, I've had to navigate a great many situations where the right thing and the procedurally correct thing were not the same thing. He paused. What happened in this building today, both the security threat and its resolution, are going to require a full review. That review is going to look at a lot of decisions made by a lot of people, including mine. He said it without flinching, which she noted. I want you to know that the review will reflect accurately what occurred, not a protected version of it. She looked at him. That would be a change, she said. It landed. He received it without recoiling. Yes, he said. I imagine it would be. He extended his hand. She shook it. He turned and went back toward the administrative corridor with his 2 attendants, and Hannah watched him go and thought that the conversation had been more honest than she had expected and less than what was needed, and that both of those things were probably accurate assessments of where the institution currently was. At 6:15, Victor Hale was formally charged. She wasn't in the room. She was in Bay 5 managing a pediatric asthma case, a 7-year-old boy named Darius who was responding well to the nebulizer treatment and who had decided, in the specific way of 7-year-olds, that the best use of the waiting time was to ask Hannah a series of increasingly specific questions about how lungs worked. She answered them all, because he was paying attention in a way that deserved attention in return, and because the normalcy of it, a child's genuine curiosity, the straightforward mechanics of explanation, was doing something for her that she hadn't realized she needed. Marcus found her there and said quietly from the doorway, "They charged him. It's on the federal docket. Espionage, wire fraud, accessory to assault of a federal official." "Okay," she said. "The lawyers are saying he'll try to negotiate. Give up the network contacts in exchange for reduced charges. That's between him and the federal prosecutors." She looked at Darius, who was listening to his own breathing through the nebulizer mask with the focused attention of someone monitoring a process. "Is your breathing easier?" He considered. "A little. That's how it works, slow and then better. You don't notice it happening, and then it already has." He accepted this. Hannah made a note in the chart. At 6:47, Scar found her. She had learned by this point that his name was Donnelly, Agent Donnelly, technically, though the tactical operators didn't use titles among themselves in any way she had observed. He came to the nursing station when the evening shift was beginning to overlap with the day shift, that chaotic 20 minutes where two complete sets of staff are simultaneously present and everything is in motion. And he stood across the station from her with the directness of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it. "They're releasing your service record," he said. "Partial declassification. Rice authorized it." She looked up from the chart. "The relevant portions," he said. "Enough to establish context for the federal case. Your training, your operational history, your classification level." He paused. "The hospital administration will receive a copy tonight." She set the chart down. "There was a conversation," Donnelly said, "about whether you'd want that, whether you'd prefer to keep it quiet." And Rice said he didn't know your preference, but that the record was relevant to the case and the decision wasn't solely yours to make. He looked at her. "He also said you'd probably say it didn't matter." She thought about the question, about what it meant for the record to exist in this building, in these files, among the people who had watched her drop a saline bag and laughed, about what it meant for it not to exist. "It doesn't change today," she said. "No," Donnelly agreed. "It doesn't. But it changes tomorrow." He nodded. "It changes tomorrow." She picked up the chart again. "Tell Rice thank you." Donnelly left. Hannah finished the note she was writing. Around her, the evening shift transition continued. New faces, old problems, the ongoing, unceasing work of the department that had absorbed a federal security event and an arrest of its chief surgeon and a post-surgical cardiac event, and was still here, still taking patients, still doing the thing it was supposed to do because that was the nature of it, and you either kept up with that nature or you didn't. She was finishing the handoff notes for the oncoming charge nurse when Dr. Kyle Marsh appeared at the station for the second time that evening. He had his coat on, end of shift, and he stood for a moment without speaking, and she could see him composing something. "I pulled Hale's communication logs," he said, "from the hospital system. I know the federal team already has them, but I was one of the people he talked to regularly, about staffing, about the rotation schedule." He stopped. "I don't know what I gave him without knowing I was giving it. I don't know what he passed on." She looked at him. He was 28, she estimated. Maybe 29. He had been a good resident today, shaken and then functional, which was about all you could ask of someone his age in this situation. "Talk to the federal investigators," she said. "Tell them exactly what you told me. They'll help you sort out what matters." "Are you going to be okay?" he said. "I mean, are you going to be here after all this?" It was not a clinical question. She recognized it as something more like concern, genuine and slightly clumsy, the kind that didn't know what form to take, and so took the direct one. "I don't know yet," she said. And that was true. He nodded. He left. She stood at the station for a moment after he was gone, looking at the board, the bay assignments, the patient list, the flow of the department, and she thought about the question, about here, and what here meant now, and whether it meant the same thing tomorrow that it had meant this morning. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a hospital extension she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. The day had contained enough phone calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and the shift was ending, and her shoulder hurt, and she was tired in the specific bone-deep way of someone who has been running hard since before 7 in the morning. She answered it. "At Nurse Brooks." The voice was female, careful, and familiar in a way that took her 2 seconds to place. The woman in the suit, who had been on the secure phone behind Rice when they first arrived, the one who had relayed information without ever introducing herself. I need you to come to the administrative conference room, second floor. I'm finishing a shift handoff. I know. When you're done, it won't take long. A pause. The decryption team finished the secondary file analysis an hour ago. There's something in it that pertains to you specifically. Commander Rice believes you should see it before it's filed. Hannah looked at the board, at the bays, at Marcus, who was handling the last walk-in of the day with the easy efficiency of someone who had grown considerably since 7 this morning. Give me 20 minutes, she said. She finished the handoff. She updated the last 2 charts. She told Marcus he'd done well today, in the same flat, direct way she said anything, and he looked at her like she'd handed him something he didn't know how to hold, and she decided that was his to figure out. She took the elevator to the second floor. The administrative conference room was at the end of the corridor, past the offices, past the framed photos of past department chiefs that lined the wall in chronological order. She walked past them without looking at them because she had never looked at them, and pushed open the conference room door. Rice was there, the suited woman, 2 federal analysts with laptops, and on the screen at the end of the table, projected, clear, the kind of visible that meant it was meant to be seen, a communication log, timestamps, an internal hospital account, a name she recognized from the day's records as belonging to Victor Hale, and beside it, in a second column she had not expected, a second account, a second name, one she had not anticipated, one that was not Victor Hale's. She stood in the doorway and looked at the screen, and the room went very quiet around her, and Rice said, "Close the door, Brooks." And she did, and she stood there looking at the second name and understanding that the thing she thought was resolved had a room she hadn't opened yet, and inside it was something that changed the shape of everything that had already happened. She stood in the doorway and looked at the second name and understanding that the thing she thought was resolved had a room she hadn't opened yet, and inside it was something that changed the shape of everything that had already happened. The name on the screen was Dr. Raymond Pollock. She knew him, not well. He was the hospital's chief administrative officer, the man who sat between Samuel Grant and the operational reality of the institution, who managed the budget allocations and the vendor contracts and the facility maintenance schedules, the man who would have access to floor plans, to electrical panel documentation, to OR configuration files, to everything that Hale had allegedly provided, except that Hale's account showed him receiving as much as he was sending, and Pollock's account, the second column, the one she hadn't expected, showed him as the origin point, not an accomplice, a handler. She walked to the table and sat down, which she did because her legs made the decision before her brain fully caught up with it, and she looked at the screen and said, "Walk me through it." The federal analyst, a young woman whose name Hannah didn't know and didn't ask for, pulled up the timeline. The communication structure was clear once you understood the architecture. Pollock had initiated contact with the external network 14 months ago, 2 months before Hale was ever approached. The debt leverage on Hale had been engineered. Pollock had provided the network with Hale's financial records, had identified him as a viable secondary source, had essentially gift-wrapped a colleague, and handed him to an organization that then used him as a conduit while Pollock maintained the appearance of administrative distance. Hale had been a tool, a guilty one. He had made choices, had fed information knowingly, had accepted payment, but a tool nonetheless, selected and deployed by a man who had worked in the office 4 doors down from the CEO for 7 years. "When did you identify the second account?" Hannah said. "The secondary decryption file completed at 5:40, the analyst said. "Pollock's account used a proxy layer that Hale's didn't. It took longer to trace." "Where is he now?" Rice answered. "His office. He hasn't been notified. We wanted you to see this first." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because his administrative access includes staff records, including yours, including the partial declassification we processed this afternoon." He paused. "We wanted to confirm he hadn't accessed those files before we move on him." "Had he?" "No, his last system access was at 4:52, before the declassification was processed." She sat with that for a moment, the specific, narrow near-miss of it, the fact that the man who had helped build the architecture of the day's danger had not had time to know that the woman he'd spent 7 years ignoring in the hallways had a service record that would have changed his calculations entirely. "He's been here all afternoon," she said. "Yes." While the federal investigation was ongoing, while Hale was being arrested and charged, she thought about Raymond Pollock, his face, which she could barely place, a background figure in institutional photographs, a name on memos she had never read closely. He thought Hale was taking the full weight of it. "That appears to be the design," Rice said. She looked at the screen, at the timestamps, at the specific documented architecture of a betrayal that had been built carefully over more than a year, that had used a colleague's weakness as structural material, that had put Evelyn Cross on a table and put 3 armed men inside a hospital, and had done all of it from behind the cover of administrative invisibility. "Take him," she said. Rice nodded. He was already on the phone. She did not go to watch the arrest. She had been present for Hale's, had stood in that corridor because the geometry of the day had put her there, but she had no need to witness Pollock's, and she was aware of the difference between justice happening and a person needing to see it happen. The former mattered. The latter was about something else, something she didn't want to feed. She went instead back down to the ER, because that was where she had been for 11 hours, and where she knew what to do, and she stood at the nursing station for a few minutes doing nothing except being there, which was its own kind of anchoring. The evening shift was fully in motion. The day's extraordinary events had been absorbed into the department's operational reality with the particular resilience of emergency medicine. Not forgotten, not minimized, but metabolized, the way trauma departments metabolize everything, because stopping is not an option, and the alternative to keeping up is falling behind. Marcus was at the end of his extended shift, finishing notes, and he looked up when she appeared at the station and said, "Pollock," in a quiet voice that told her the information had moved faster than the official channels. "Yes," she said. "He was at the all-hands meeting 3 months ago," Marcus said, "the one about budget reallocations. He gave a speech about institutional integrity." She looked at him. "I'm just saying," Marcus said. "It's a lot." "It's a lot," she agreed. She updated 2 charts, checked the board, confirmed that Bay 3, Gerald Foss, had been cleared for discharge by Tolliver's resident 20 minutes ago, and that the paperwork was waiting. She went to Bay 3 and found Foss already dressed, Patrice helping him with his jacket. "Heard there was another arrest," Foss said. "Discharge instructions are on the tablet," Hannah said. "Cardiology follow-up within 2 weeks. The office number is at the bottom. Don't ignore the follow-up." "I won't," Patrice said with the tone of a woman who intended to personally ensure this. Foss stood carefully, testing his legs. He looked at Hannah with the sharp, patient eyes he'd had all day. "You've been here since before 7, he said. "I was watching the shift board. Shifts run long sometimes." "That's not what I mean." He found what he was looking for in her face, or didn't find it, and seemed to decide something. "Whatever you did today, I don't know the specifics, and I don't need to, but you look like someone who did a thing that was necessary and is now wondering if necessary was enough." She didn't answer. "It usually is," he said. "In my experience, necessary is mostly what we have." He walked out with Patrice's hand under his elbow, and Hannah watched them go through the automatic doors into the evening, and she stood at the discharge threshold for a moment before turning back to the department. Raymond Pollock was arrested at 7:22 in his own office by 2 federal agents while Commander Rice observed. He did not go quietly in the sense of dignity. There was a period of approximately 4 minutes during which he attempted to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that his communications were professional in nature, that he would like to speak with the hospital's legal counsel. The agents waded through it with the patience of people who had heard similar speeches and knew what came after. Then they walked him out through the administrative corridor and into the parking structure, which was not the main entrance, which Rice had arranged specifically. But the main entrance was where shift change happened. And shift change was where nurses and techs and residents crossed paths with the administrative staff in the ordinary overlap of a working institution. And someone saw, and then someone else saw, and by 7:40 the information had moved through the building with the speed and thoroughness of the particular communication network that exists in every hospital everywhere, invisible to administration and entirely reliable. Hannah heard about it from Iris, the recovery room nurse, who came to find her at 7:50 with an expression that was trying to be professionally neutral and not quite achieving it. "They took Pollock," Iris said. "I know. He was the one who... He started the whole thing. He set Hale up." "He was involved," Hannah said carefully. "Hale's still going to prison." "Hale made his own choices," Hannah said. "Both of those things can be true." Iris stood with that for a moment. She was a good nurse. Hannah had seen that clearly in the recovery room, in the speed and competence of her response to Cross's arrhythmia. She had the quality of someone who would get better for a long time, yet if the environment gave her room to. "Cross is stable," Iris said. "Tolliver moved her to the cardiac step-down unit an hour ago. Serial ECGs are clean." "Good," Hannah said. And she meant it fully, without qualification. Evelyn Cross was alive, and the chain of events and decisions and small violent moments that had kept her alive was complete, and that was what mattered most in the final accounting. "She asked about you," Iris said. "Cross?" "She was conscious for a little while before the transfer. She asked who the nurse was." "In the trauma bay, when she first came in." Hannah looked at her. "I told her your name," Iris said. "She said she'd remember it." A pause. "I think she meant it." At 8:15, Dr. Samuel Grant called a department meeting. It was not announced through the PA or the official communication system. It was communicated the way things get communicated in hospitals when the administration wants genuine attendance rather than performed attendance. Through the charge nurses, through the shift leads, through the informal network that Pollock had apparently failed to understand, ran the institution more reliably than any of the official channels he had spent 7 years managing. The meeting was in the main conference room on the first floor, which held about 40 people comfortably and was holding significantly more than that when Hannah arrived. She stood near the back because the front was occupied by the people who positioned themselves at fronts of rooms, and she had never been one of them. Grant stood at the front without notes. He had taken his suit jacket off at some point since their conversation in the ER, and the absence of it made him look more like a person and less like a position, which she suspected was not an accident. He told them the truth. Not all of it. Some of it remained under federal seal, and he said so explicitly, which she respected. But the structural truth, the shape of it, that Raymond Pollock had been the primary architect of the security threat, that Victor Hale had been recruited by that architecture, that both men had provided information that had endangered a federal official and the staff and patients of this hospital. He did not euphemize. He did not use the language of institutional protection. He said what had happened in the plainest terms available, and then he said something she had not anticipated. "I also need to address something that happened earlier today in this department, an event that has direct bearing on what followed." He paused. "A member of our nursing staff was told this morning that she was not qualified to be in a trauma room. She was removed from an active trauma rotation and directed to manage walk-in triage. That decision was made by Dr. Hale, but it was made in an environment that this institution has permitted to exist, one where the competence of nursing staff is routinely underestimated and where that underestimation carries no professional consequences." He looked at the room. "What happened this afternoon demonstrates, with more clarity than I could have designed if I tried, what that kind of environment costs. We nearly lost a patient and several staff members because the most qualified person in this building was told she didn't belong in the room where she was needed most. The room was quiet. That won't be an ongoing feature of this institution," he said. "That's not a promise. It's a policy. And it will be documented as such, with review mechanisms I'll be outlining with department heads over the next 2 weeks." He looked toward the back of the room. 40 people looked with him. Hannah stood at the back with her badge on straight and her shoulder hurting and dried saline from 11 hours ago still on her scrubs, and she looked at the front of the room, not at the people looking at her, because the moment didn't require her to perform anything for their benefit. It required her to be present in it and receive it honestly, and that was what she did. Grant said, "Thank you." And the meeting was over, and it was not a resolution exactly. Resolutions in institutions took months and reviews and documented policy changes, and still often failed. But it was a beginning stated publicly, which was the only kind of beginning that had any chance. She stayed until 9, not because she was required to, her shift had technically ended 2 hours ago, but because there were 2 charts she wanted to finish and a supply order she wanted to verify before the night team took over, and because leaving felt abrupt in a way that didn't match the day. The day required a proper transition. She gave it one. At 8:57, Donnelly found her in the supply corridor. He was in civilian clothes. End of operational duty, she assumed, the agent cycling out as the federal scene wound down. And he looked different without the tactical gear, younger and more recognizably tired, and he held out a card which was a federal contact number and Rice's direct line. Rice wants to debrief you formally, he said. When you're ready, no timeline. She took the card. He also wants me to tell you something. Donnelly paused in the way of someone delivering a message that is not in their own register, but which they are delivering faithfully. He said the decision you made 4 years ago, to leave, was yours to make, and he's not going to relitigate it. But he also said the service record we declassified today is going to be visible now, to people who make certain kinds of decisions, and that if you ever... He stopped. He said you'd know what he meant. She thought about what Rice meant. She thought about the classified phone call at 1:44 and the code in the dead air and the 40 minutes, compressed to 22, and the decision she had made in the ambulance bay with half a turkey sandwich and the specific weight of a life she had left behind pressing back against her through a phone she had almost not answered. Tell him I heard him, she said. Donnelly nodded. He left. She finished the supply verification. She wrote the last of the chart notes. She said goodnight to the night charge nurse and to Marcus, who was finally, actually leaving, pulling on his jacket at the station with the expression of someone who had aged approximately 3 years in the past 14 hours and was still upright, which was its own form of achievement. Go home, she said. Going, he said. You? In a minute. He left. The department continued around her in the night shift key, quieter, different energy, the specific nocturnal rhythm of a place that never fully sleeps but changes its pitch after dark. She stood at the nursing station one more time. She thought about what Gerald Foss had said, about necessary, about whether necessary was enough. She thought it usually was. She thought he was right about that, in the way that simple things said by plain people are sometimes exactly right, without ceremony or complication. She thought about the morning, about the saline bag and the patient chart on the floor, and Victor Hale's voice saying, "Get out." And she thought about the fact that humiliation and accuracy are not the same thing, that being seen badly by people who have not looked carefully is not evidence of what you are. She had known that. She had known it before today. But there's a difference between knowing a thing in your mind and having it demonstrated in front of 40 people at 8:15 on a Tuesday evening, and the demonstration mattered, not for her ego, for the record, for the shape of what the day would leave behind in this building when all of it had been processed and filed. She clipped her badge straight. She picked up her bag. She was at the automatic doors when she heard her name. She turned. The woman in the corridor was small, moving carefully with the specific conserved energy of someone who has been told to rest and has decided the rest can wait 30 seconds. She was in a hospital gown with a monitor lead still visible at her collar, and she had a federal agent hovering 3 feet behind her who was visibly unhappy about this excursion and doing nothing to stop it, which meant she had told him she was going, and he had calculated that stopping her was not worth what it would cost him. Evelyn Cross looked at Hannah from 20 feet away with the clear, assessing eyes of a woman who had spent a career reading people in high-stakes environments and who was currently applying that skill at the end of what had been the worst day of her life. Hannah stood at the automatic doors and let herself be looked at. Cross crossed the distance slowly and stopped 4 feet away. Up close she looked worse than she had on the gurney. The bruising, the pallor, the specific diminishment of someone who has been through major surgery and a cardiac event in the same afternoon. And she also looked more present, more herself, the way people sometimes become more vivid when the alternative has been close enough to feel. "I'm told," Cross said, "that you stabilized me in the trauma bay, stopped the power interruption to my OR, converted my arrhythmia in recovery." A pause. "And took down 2.5 armed operatives in the corridors." "2," Hannah said. "The third one I slowed down. Your operators finished it." Cross looked at her. The assessment in her eyes completed itself, arrived at a conclusion, and settled. "Why are you still a floor nurse?" she said. It was not unkind. It was the question asked by someone who genuinely wants to understand a thing, who considers the failure to understand it a gap in their own knowledge rather than a judgment on the subject. Hannah thought about the answer, about all the true answers available and which one was the most accurate. Because people need floor nurses, she said. Cross considered this. That's a real answer, she said, but it's not the whole one. No, Hannah said. It's not. Cross waited. I left because I needed to, Hannah said. I stayed because it turned out to matter. Both of those things have been true the whole time. I just didn't always know how to hold them both at once. Cross nodded slowly. She reached into the pocket of her hospital gown, an incongruous gesture, a woman in a gown having pockets, but apparently she did, and she pulled out a card and held it out. Her hand was steadier than it had any right to be. Hannah took it. A name, a federal department designation, a contact number. When you're ready to hold both things at once, Cross said, call that number. She turned and walked back toward the step-down unit with her federal agent behind her, and Hannah stood at the automatic doors with the card in her hand and the evening air coming in from outside, cool and smelling like pine and the distant paper mill. The federal case against Victor Hale and Raymond Pollock moved through the legal system with the particular speed reserved for cases where the evidence was thorough and the defendants were not sympathetic figures. Hale's lawyer's motion to suppress was denied within 2 weeks. The legal basis for the intercepts was exactly as solid as Rice had said it was. Pollock's attempt to negotiate a reduced charge structure collapsed when the full scope of the secondary decryption files became clear in the discovery process. Hale's medical license was suspended pending resolution of the federal charges, and then, 6 weeks after his arrest, it was revoked permanently by the Oregon Medical Board in a hearing that took 45 minutes. I was present. He did not speak during the revocation. The hearing was public record. He entered a guilty plea on 3 of the 8 federal counts in the 10th week. The plea agreement required full cooperation with the investigation into the external network, names, contact information, operational methods. He provided all of it. His cooperation was noted in the sentencing recommendation, which described his culpability as significant and his cooperation as genuine, and the judge sentenced him to 9 years. He would be 61 when he was released. His surgical career was over. Everything he had spent 3 decades building in the specific way he had built it, through excellence and cruelty, and the belief that the two were related, was finished, not because his hands had failed him, but because he had decided that his problems were someone else's burden to carry and had chosen the wrong people to assign that burden to. Pollock received 14 years. He had no cooperation to offer, having structured his involvement so carefully that dismantling it required the full weight of federal forensic accounting, and the jury found him guilty on 11 counts in a trial that lasted 8 days. He had sat through the proceedings in the specific composure of someone who had spent a career managing appearances and who was applying that skill to the last professional context available to him. It didn't help. Both verdicts were public. Both were reported. Stonebridge Regional Medical Center issued a formal institutional statement acknowledging the events, the arrests, the systemic failures that had permitted the environment in which those failures occurred, and the steps being taken in response. The statement was reviewed by Hannah before it was published, not because she had requested that, but because Samuel Grant had asked, and she had read it and identified 3 places where the language softened the actual sequence of events, and she had said so, and Grant had changed them. The statement went out with the harder language intact. She stayed. That was the decision, arrived at over 3 weeks and not a single dramatic moment, not a conversation that changed everything, not a revelation that made the choice obvious. It was a series of small reckonings, Marcus asking her a clinical question and watching her answer it and reaching for a pen to write it down. Iris requesting her specifically for a post-surgical monitoring case and then another. Marsh, Dr. Kyle Marsh, who was becoming a better physician in the specific way of people who have had something true demonstrated to them at a formative moment, stopping her in the corridor to talk through a diagnosis and accepting her answer not because of hierarchy, but because he had started to understand what her judgment was worth. And the patients, the ones who didn't know any of it, who didn't know about the day in October, about the federal case, about the declassified record that now sat in the hospital personnel file under her name. The ones who needed the IV checked and the discharge instructions explained, and someone to notice that the blood pressure reading was high enough to warrant a rescheduled appointment. She stayed because the work was real, because real was what she had always been drawn toward and what she was best at. Because the particular kind of attention emergency medicine required, total, immediate, undivided, was the one form of attention that had always felt most like herself. She called the number on Cross's card on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the arrest, standing in the ambulance bay with a coffee that was better than the machine coffee because Marcus had started bringing her one from the place around the corner. She didn't know exactly what calling the number would lead to. She called it anyway because Cross had been right that she wasn't holding both things at once yet, and the only way to learn to hold something was to pick it up. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. She did not make a decision at the end of it. She agreed to another conversation, and then another, and the shape of something began to emerge. Not a return to what she had been, because that was not available and she had not asked for it, but a new configuration, a way of being in both worlds that she had spent 4 years believing were incompatible. They were not incompatible. They were just heavy, carried separately. Together, differently distributed, they were manageable. She called her brother that evening. He lived in Portland, worked in construction management, had 2 kids she saw at holidays, and occasionally surprised with visits that he received by pretending to be less glad than he was. She hadn't told him about October. She told him now. Not everything, not the classified portions, but the shape of it, the day, the morning, and what it had contained and what had followed. He was quiet on the phone for a long time after she finished. "You were always doing stuff like that," he said, "even when we were kids, just quietly handling the thing that needed handling and then acting like it was nothing." "I never acted like it was nothing. You never talked about it," he said, "which is close." She thought about that, about the difference between quiet strength and invisible strength, and whether she had been confusing them for most of her adult life. Quiet meant the work spoke. Invisible meant you had accepted that it wouldn't. She had been doing both, and she had not always been able to tell them apart. "I'll come up next month," she said, "for the weekend." "Good," he said, and the simplicity of it, the completeness of a word that meant yes, finally, more of this, was its own kind of arrival. In the spring, 3 months after the sentencing, Stonebridge Regional held a department recognition ceremony. It was not a large event, the hospital's conference room, the staff who could make it, sandwiches from the place around the corner that Marcus had introduced Hannah to, and which had quietly become the department's default option for anything celebratory. Samuel Grant spoke briefly, because brief was appropriate, and he said accurate things about what the institution had learned and was continuing to learn, and then he asked Hannah to come to the front of the room. She went, because refusing would have been a performance of a different kind, and she was done with performances. He said her name and her role, and then he said something she had not expected him to say. Not the full record, not the classified history, but the plain version of the truth. That she had been dismissed from an active trauma role on the morning of the day she saved the department. That the dismissal had been wrong. That the institution acknowledged it publicly and specifically, not as a general statement about systemic failures, but as a concrete accounting of what had happened to a specific person. The room was quiet while he said it, and then it was not quiet. It was not a standing ovation in the cinematic sense. It was 40-some-odd medical professionals, most of them tired, all of them real, clapping in the slightly uneven way of people who are not performers and are not trying to be. Iris was there, and Marcus, and Marsh, and the night charge nurse whose name was Delia, and who had worked at Stonebridge for 19 years, and who clapped the hardest of anyone in the room. Dottie Farrell had come in on her day off, which Hannah had not expected, and which she registered without showing. Hannah stood at the front of the room and looked out at the people who had been in this building with her for 3 years, who had not known her and had also known her in the way that colleagues know each other, imperfectly, partially, through the daily accumulation of shared work, and she felt the weight of the day in October leaving her body in a way it hadn't fully done yet. Not all at once, but in that moment with enough of it gone to feel the difference. She was not the same person she had been at 6:47 that morning, walking into a building where no one knew what she carried. She was not a different person either. She was the same person with the record visible, with the context present, with the morning's humiliation on record next to the day's accounting, and anyone who wanted to could look at both and understand what the distance between them meant. "Thank you," she said. It was all she said. She meant it for the room, for the work, for the specific hard-won fact of being seen accurately by people who had chosen to look. She went back to her place near the wall. She thought about the people who move through the world with something significant inside them, some capacity, some history, some depth of competence, that the people around them never look for because they've already decided what they're seeing. She thought about how often the person dismissed in the morning is the person indispensable by evening, and how rarely that accounting gets made explicit, and how much the people who carry quiet weight pay for the silence around it. She thought the work was always real, the invisibility was the lie. And she thought about every person who has ever been told to stay in their lane by someone who had not checked how wide their lane actually was. Every nurse, every technician, every person in a room full of people who have already made up their minds. And she thought that the answer to being underestimated was not to announce yourself. It was to keep working, to keep the IV running and the chart accurate and the arrhythmia converted and the panel from being interrupted, and to let the day make its own argument. The day always makes its argument eventually. You just have to still be standing when it does. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Hannah Brooks arrived at Stonebridge Regional at 6:47. She changed into her scrubs. She clipped her badge to her chest. She got the bad coffee from the machine near the nursing station because Marcus didn't arrive until 7, and the good coffee came with him. The night charge nurse handed off the board, a femur fracture waiting on ortho, a chest pain in Bay 2, a child who may or may not have swallowed something, details unclear. "Busy night," the charge nurse said. "I'll handle it," Hannah said. She picked up the first chart. She went to work. The federal case against Victor Hale and Raymond Pollock moved through the legal system with the particular speed reserved for cases where the evidence was thorough and the defendants were not sympathetic figures. Hale's lawyer's motion to suppress was denied within 2 weeks. The legal basis for the intercepts was exactly as solid as Rice had said it was. Pollock's attempt to negotiate a reduced charge structure collapsed when the full scope of the secondary decryption files became clear in the discovery process. Hale's medical license was suspended pending resolution of the federal charges, and then, 6 weeks after his arrest, it was revoked permanently by the Oregon Medical Board in a hearing that took 45 minutes. He was present. He did not speak during the revocation. The hearing was public record. He entered a guilty plea on 3 of the 8 federal counts in the 10th week. The plea agreement required full cooperation with the investigation into the external network: names, contact information, operational methods. He provided all of it. His cooperation was noted in the sentencing recommendation, which described his culpability as significant and his cooperation as genuine, and the judge sentenced him to 9 years. He would be 61 when he was released. His surgical career was over. Everything he had spent 3 decades building in the specific way he had built it, through excellence and cruelty and the belief that the two were related, was finished, not because his hands had failed him, but because he had decided that his problems were someone else's burden to carry and had chosen the wrong people to assign that burden to. Pollock received 14 years. He had no cooperation to offer, having structured his involvement so carefully that dismantling it required the full weight of federal forensic accounting, and the jury found him guilty on 11 counts in a trial that lasted 8 days. He had sat through the proceedings in the specific composure of someone who had spent a career managing appearances and who was applying that skill to the last professional context available to him. It didn't help. Both verdicts were public. Both were reported. Stonebridge Regional Medical Center issued a formal institutional statement acknowledging the events, the arrests, the systemic failures that had permitted the environment in which those failures occurred, and the steps being taken in response. The statement was reviewed by Hannah before it was published, not because she had requested that, but because Samuel Grant had asked, and she had read it and identified 3 places where the language softened the actual sequence of events, and she had said so, and Grant had changed them. The statement went out with the harder language intact. She stayed. That was the decision, arrived at over 3 weeks and not a single dramatic moment, not a conversation that changed everything, not a revelation that made the choice obvious. It was a series of small reckonings, Marcus asking her a clinical question and watching her answer it and reaching for a pen to write it down, Iris requesting her specifically for a post-surgical monitoring case, and then another. Marsh, Dr. Kyle Marsh, who was becoming a better physician in the specific way of people who have had something true demonstrated to them at a formative moment, stopping her in the corridor to talk through a diagnosis and accepting her answer not because of hierarchy, but because he had started to understand what her judgment was worth. And the patients. The ones who didn't know any of it, who didn't know about the day in October, about the federal case, about the declassified record that now sat in the hospital personnel file under her name. The ones who needed the IV checked and the discharge instructions explained, and someone to notice that the blood pressure reading was high enough to warrant a rescheduled appointment. She stayed because the work was real, because real was what she had always been drawn toward, and what she was best at. Because the particular kind of attention emergency medicine required, total, immediate, undivided, was the one form of attention that had always felt most like herself. She called the number on Cross's card on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the arrest, standing in the ambulance bay with a coffee that was better than the machine coffee, because Marcus had started bringing her one from the place around the corner. She didn't know exactly what calling the number would lead to. She called it anyway because Cross had been right that she wasn't holding both things at once yet, and the only way to learn to hold something was to pick it up. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. She did not make a decision at the end of it. She agreed to another conversation, and then another, and the shape of something began to emerge. Not a return to what she had been, because that was not available and she had not asked for it, but a new configuration, a way of being in both worlds that she had spent 4 years believing were incompatible. They were not incompatible. They were just heavy, carried separately. Together, differently distributed, they were manageable. She called her brother that evening. He lived in Portland, worked in construction management, had 2 kids she saw at holidays, and occasionally surprised with visits that he received by pretending to be less glad than he was. She hadn't told him about October. She told him now. Not everything, not the classified portions, but the shape of it, the day, the morning, and what it had contained and what had followed. He was quiet on the phone for a long time after she finished. "You were always doing stuff like that," he said, "even when we were kids. Just quietly handling the thing that needed handling and then acting like it was nothing." "I never acted like it was nothing." "You never talked about it," he said, "which is close." She thought about that, about the difference between quiet strength and invisible strength, and whether she had been confusing them for most of her adult life. Quiet meant the work spoke. Invisible meant you had accepted that it wouldn't. She had been doing both, and she had not always been able to tell them apart. "I'll come up next month," she said, "for the weekend." "Good," he said, and the simplicity of it, the completeness of a word that meant yes, finally, more of this, was its own kind of arrival. In the spring, 3 months after the sentencing, Stonebridge Regional held a department recognition ceremony. It was not a large event, the hospital's conference room, the staff who could make it, sandwiches from the place around the corner that Marcus had introduced Hannah to, and which had quietly become the department's default option for anything celebratory. Samuel Grant spoke briefly, because brief was appropriate, and he said accurate things about what the institution had learned and was continuing to learn, and then he asked Hannah to come to the front of the room. She went, because refusing would have been a performance of a different kind, and she was done with performances. He said her name and her role, and then he said something she had not expected him to say. Not the full record, not the classified history, but the plain version of the truth, that she had been dismissed from an active trauma role on the morning of the day she saved the department, that the dismissal had been wrong, that the institution acknowledged it publicly and specifically, not as a general statement about systemic failures, but as a concrete accounting of what had happened to a specific person. The room was quiet while he said it, and then it was not quiet. It was not a standing ovation in the cinematic sense. It was 40-some-odd medical professionals, most of them tired, all of them real, clapping in the slightly uneven way of people who are not performers and are not trying to be. Iris was there, and Marcus, and Marsh, and the night charge nurse whose name was Delia, and who had worked at Stonebridge for 19 years, and who clapped the hardest of anyone in the room. Dottie Farrell had come in on her day off, which Hannah had not expected and which she registered without showing. Hannah stood at the front of the room and looked out at the people who had been in this building with her for 3 years, who had not known her, and had also known her in the way that colleagues know each other, imperfectly, partially, through the daily accumulation of shared work. And she felt the weight of the day in October leaving her body in a way it hadn't fully done yet, not all at once, but in that moment with enough of it gone to feel the difference. She was not the same person she had been at 6:47 that morning, walking into a building where no one knew what she carried. She was not a different person either. She was the same person with the record visible, with the context present, with the morning's humiliation on record next to the day's accounting, and anyone who wanted to could look at both and understand what the distance between them meant. "Thank you," she said. It was all she said. She meant it for the room, for the work, for the specific, hard-won fact of being seen accurately by people who had chosen to look. She went back to her place near the wall. She thought about the people who moved through the world with something significant inside them, some capacity, some history, some depth of competence, that the people around them never look for because they've already decided what they're seeing. She thought about how often the person dismissed in the morning is the person indispensable by evening, and how rarely that accounting gets made explicit, and how much the people who carry quiet weight pay for the silence around it. She thought the work was always real, the invisibility was the lie. And she thought about every person who has ever been told to stay in their lane by someone who had not checked how wide their lane actually was. Every nurse, every technician, every person in a room full of people who have already made up their minds. And she thought that the answer to being underestimated was not to announce yourself. It was to keep working, to keep the IV running and the chart accurate and the arrhythmia converted and the panel from being interrupted, and to let the day make its own argument. The day always makes its argument eventually. You just have to still be standing when it does. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Hannah Brooks arrived at Stonebridge Regional at 6:47. She changed into her scrubs. She clipped her badge to her chest. She got the bad coffee from the machine near the nursing station because Marcus didn't arrive until 7 and the good coffee came with him. The night charge nurse handed off the board, a femur fracture waiting on ortho, a chest pain in Bay 2. A child who may or may not have swallowed something, details unclear. "Busy night," the charge nurse said. "I'll handle it," Hannah said. She picked up the first chart. She went to work.